Welcome to the Humanist Freedoms podcast by Humanist Heritage Canada. We share stories and perspectives from Canada's ongoing humanist heritage. You can find us online at www.humanistfreedoms.com or www.humanistheritagecanada.ca, where you may find the Humanist Freedoms news blog. We share news, information, and stories about what we call contemporary applied humanism. It's humanism in action. Humanist Heritage Canada is our new initiative to document and share the stories of Canada's rich humanist heritage. "12 Steps to True Democracy." I was going to entitle this talk 12 Steps to Restore Democracy, but I grow increasingly doubtful that true democracy has ever existed, except perhaps in the very distant past. At a time before the Neolithic Revolution, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, drifting in small groups with the seasons, may have been able to govern themselves as equal partners. But at the dawn of settlement and farming, when the means and ways to amass possessions and eventually fortunes became available, the selfish gene began to turn human relationships into a battle for domination, with the predictable result of millennia of tyranny and warfare. But the indomitable human spirit struggled against the dictatorship of our lowest instincts for aggression and exploitation. Democratic practices returned, and in our Western civilization, democracy became a visible form of political governance 2,500 years ago in Athens and other Greek city-states. It was flawed, and its practice lasted barely 2 centuries before it was crushed under the boots of a Macedonian army. Fortunately, the dream of democracy lived on. Its struggles against the reality of oppression and tyranny finally triumphed in 18th century Enlightenment when the American Declaration of Independence, 1776, affirmed it to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. These principles, along with their succinct summation in the rallying call of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, have become the universal standard of liberal democracy in our time. What they demand is that a nation shall be ruled by, in Daniel Webster's phrase, the people's government made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. In the 21st century, most countries in the world consider themselves democracies, but few, if any, satisfy Webster's lofty definition. Old world countries like England and France, straddled with stultifying legacies of colonialism, self-serving notions of aristocracy and class consciousness, practice a democracy often difficult to distinguish from oligarchy, where the populace is largely reduced to rubber stamping the policies of an elite. In New World democracies, like those of many African nations struggling with extreme poverty and neo-colonialism, government is often a more or less concealed form of autocracy. The Democratic People's Republic of North Korea is a brutal one-party dictatorship. Russians currently enjoy a form of government that Kremlin describes as managed democracy. A one-man, one-party rule that includes censorship of the media, persecution of dissidents, ethnic cleansing in Chechnya, and a war of conquest in Ukraine. Most troubling of all, in the U.S., cradle of modern democracy, democracy has become a two-party plutocracy determined to maintain the illusion of freedom and social justice, to make a very different reality in which greed and wealth rule. In the face of this situation, an extraterrestrial visitor might surely be challenged to understand what we mean by liberty. She might be even more perplexed to hear the loud, universal proclamations and protestations of the equality of people, and yet to find herself on a planet where 50% of the total global wealth is in the hands of a single nation that constitutes less than 5% of the world's population, half of which live on less than $2 a day, whereas the average income of people in the developed world is closer to $60 or $70 a day. And for some rare specimen of the Homo mercatorius, known as CEOs, it is more than $400,000 a day or $50,000 an hour. Our untutored extraterrestrial might also have a problem appreciating our sense of fraternity when confronted with the fact that on this earth 1 billion people go hungry every day and that 11 million children under the age of 5 die every year from preventable diseases and starvation. That's about 20 every minute, or about 1,000 while you read this. She could easily misapprehend democracy and conclude that for most of our species, happiness means the pursuit of poverty and starvation. She might be equally puzzled by our system of justice. In Canada, we have advanced a long way towards making every citizen equal before the law, but we have a long way to go yet, as is demonstrated by the many cases of innocent people who are found guilty of crimes they haven't committed and spend decades in prison before receiving justice. The fact of the matter is that money buys justice, not always or absolutely, but often enough to give us concern. Many a criminal has walked away from his or her crime because they could afford a team of shyster lawyers who twisted the letter of the law to pervert its spirit. By the same token, innocent people are often condemned because they cannot afford the legal defense to protect them from shyster police officers willing to falsify evidence to advance their careers. So much for equality before the law. The problem starts at ground level. To someone earning a minimum wage, a $100 fine for a traffic violation may constitute 10 hours of work. Someone earning $600 an hour can work off the same fine in 10 minutes. And in Canada, any one of the top 40 CEOs who have to make do with a meager average of $15 million a year can take care of his fine with all of 5 seconds or less of hard labor. Compare this to Finland, a country more advanced in democratic procedures where such fines are determined in proportion to the offender's income, and our $600 an hour individual would have to pay $6,000 for the same offense for which the minimum wage earner pays $100. That is what equality before the law means. Until we eliminate the now astronomical gap between top earners and the majority of working people by making income correspond more fairly to the contribution an individual makes to society, we shall not have equal justice for all. In a society governed by and for the people, such issues can be addressed, but we have no such government either in Canada or anywhere in Western society, except perhaps in some of the Scandinavian countries. For a demonstration of the growing distance separating people from their government, we need go no further than the 2003 war against Iraq. According to the polls, the attack on Iraq had the support of only 37% of the American people, and yet an overwhelming majority of their elected representatives, both in Congress and in the Senate, empowered their president in great haste and with little real dissent to unleash war on Iraq on a pretext so transparently false that it resulted in global derision of the White House. Polls in democratic England and democratic Spain indicated that 80% of the population in both countries were opposed to joining the US invasion, but their elected leaders took their countries to war anyway. Clearly, across the world, the mechanisms of democratic procedure are not working. Not even the UN was able to prevent the US-UK invasion of Iraq, which was supported by a tiny coalition force from other nations. This support came not from people, but from governments coerced or brought to provide a fig leaf to conceal the obscenity of the war. The true reasons for invading Iraq expose the cancer that is destroying democracy: greed, the greed of those in power. War was forced on Iraq to secure diminishing oil supplies to countries whose wealth is dependent on cheap energy and to sustain the illusion of a free market economy, an industry that thrives on products with built-in obsolescence. War is the ultimate apotheosis of consumerism. It makes every capitalist's dream come true. The redistribution of money from the pockets of the people who pay for the war, sometimes also with their lives, into the bank accounts of the owners of the military manufacturing companies who, at a safe distance from any military action, deal in products intended to self-destruct and kill as many people as possible in the process. War is big business. Canada's refusal to join in the war against Iraq certainly reflects our moral sensibilities and does suggest that our democratic structures are not yet completely corroded. The military-industrial complex is not yet as powerful here as it is in the US, but there are ominous signs that it is changing. Polls indicate consistently that our military engagement in Afghanistan is not supported by a majority of Canadians. Yet Mr. Harper, when he was the leader of a minority government, missed no opportunity to promote it quite shamelessly as a heroic national effort and send an army general on a promotional tour to work the crowds with support our troops' jingoism, to whip up enthusiasm for what is, to say the least, a morally dubious enterprise. The gradual militarization of Canadian attitudes away from peace missions to aggressive interventions, employing the gunship diplomacy the Bush administration favors, and one more sign that our democracy is in rapid decline. We have reached that point with our participation in Ukraine's war against Russia, which is engineered by the US to lure Putin into invading Ukraine. They were successful because Putin was fool enough to fall for it, driven by his appetite for reconquering parts of Ukraine that were once part of Russia. The Western media did the rest, demonstrating that they are now the voice of government. But have kept the worst for the last. The most serious disconnect between our government and the people of Canada is occurring over the catastrophic developments in our environment. The population explosion, peak oil, the pollution of the water we drink and the air we breathe, the growing threat of another pandemic, rapidly increasing extreme weather conditions, the depletion of fish stocks, the disappearance of rainforests, and the spread of the world's deserts, these are the alarming signs of a planet in deep trouble. The evidence that we human beings are primarily and probably solely responsible for this is now incontrovertible. If it is, as I fear, already too late to prevent apocalyptic events in the near future, we have only ourselves to blame, our lack of democratic political leadership, and our propensity for denial in the face of danger. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1962, and the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth, 1972, sent out a clear signal that our world was in trouble. But the warnings were ignored until the Kyoto Protocol of 1997 took the first tentative steps to reduce greenhouse gases. We may look good next to the USA, the world's biggest polluter, which has refused to this day even to sign the Kyoto Protocol, but our government has spent 10 years procrastinating, and even now it is waffling about in what time frame we will manage to meet the Kyoto emissions limits, which were known to be inadequate at the time they were adopted and are now laughable in the face of the catastrophic climate changes we are witnessing. Only suicidal maniacs proceed cheerfully and confidently to self-destruct. Why are we doing this? Because our democratic government is the executor of the will of the corporate state, for whom economic growth and maximization of profit are the very purpose and meaning of existence. We are all guilty because we have all allowed ourselves to be drawn into that deadly dance of consumerism, albeit to different degrees, and we shall all pay the price. However, there is still a chance for us to preserve a small, viable habitat on this planet for our children's children. But to secure it, we need to make drastic changes to our lifestyle and to our whole attitude towards the environment. And we need to make them now. These changes are going to be costly, and they mean an end to the new religion of the free market and continuous economic growth. That's why they are not going to be supported by big business or by the governments that operate by the good graces of capitalism. If we are ever to take the necessary steps to reverse our headlong rush into an abyss of death and destruction, that will mean the end of civilization. We need to create a government of, by, and for the people. Perhaps because the first victims of our disastrous pollution of the planet are ordinary people. There are more voices of common sense emanating from them, more willingness to change and make sacrifices, more sensitivity to the needs of our environment. It may not be enough, but it is our only chance. But, some of you might ask, is democracy the answer? Our commitment to democracy hinges on our answer to the question about the moral nature of human beings. Democracy, said Winston Churchill, is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. The acid wit of the remark cannot conceal the contempt for the commoner so characteristic of the upper classes, a a contempt that has long history, going at least as far back as Plato, whose Republic calls for government by an oligarchy of guardians, men of integrity and expertise who are to lead the ignorant masses in the ways of the common good. Similar views were argued in more recent history by political thinkers like Edmund Burke and Alexis de Tocqueville. Here is what Walter Lippmann said in 1927. The individual man does not know how to direct public affairs. He does not know what is happening, why it is happening, what ought to happen. I cannot imagine how he could know, and there is not the least reason for thinking, as mystical Democrats have thought, that the compounding of individual ignorances in masses of people can produce a continuous redirecting force in public affairs. The public must be put in its place, so that each of us may live free of the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd. This arrogant attitude is unabashedly counter-democratic. At best, it calls for a government by an elite for the people, and sooner or later that turns into government by and of and for the elite. History provides much disturbing evidence of crowds behaving like a bewildered herd, trampling our individual rights. But there is even more evidence of human beings behaving spontaneously with kindness, solidarity, consideration, respect, and yes, love, which humans bestow upon each other daily all across the globe. I am prepared to make the case that most acts of inhumanity are the results of misinformation, demagoguery, manipulation, and, above all, ignorance bred by the very institutions professing to do away with it. Our acts of compassion and mutual help come more naturally to us. We witness them in the outpouring of emotional support and financial aid whenever an individual or nations are visited by misfortune and disaster. Such acts of genuine human fellowship and sacrifice go largely unreported in the media unless they provide the kind of sensation that attended the recent tsunami disaster. Murder and mayhem make better copy in the media, but it is the small acts of decency and compassion that provide the building material holding human society together. Without it, we would have perished millennia ago. That is why I put my faith in the common sense and decency of ordinary people, and not in the arrogant hypocrisies of the rich. If we want the world to flow back from the edge of disaster and the inevitable barbarism that will follow, we must place the decision-making power in the hands of those whose future most directly depends on the triumph of a true community spirit over the egotistical profit-making mania that has led to the edge of the abyss. It's a slim chance, I admit. It may be that we are simply acting out the law of nature. William Catton Jr. has identified an overshoot, 1982, according to which any species that finds itself suddenly, through whatever circumstances of adaptation or mutation, especially well equipped to expand, dominate, and occupy a given habitat, will inevitably overshoot the carrying capacity of that habitat and succumb in the resulting crash and die off. I prefer to think that recognizing a danger is the first step to averting it. I prefer to take my chances with the best humanity is capable of. Only human beings can solve the problems of living in a world that has definite limits to the levels of comfort, happiness, and dignity it can sustain. What we need is an articulate political platform, a manifesto even, designed to help democracy mutate so it can survive in the new environment of multinational corporate power and media manipulation that threaten to render it extinct. That's why I've come to you, who, as associates of the Club of Rome, understand the gravity of our situation and have made strenuous efforts over many years to bring people and governments to their senses. Mine is just another such effort. What I'm proposing are 12 steps for people to take back their governments. Brace yourselves. They are radical steps in the original sense of the word radical from the Latin radix, root. Radical treatments are never pleasant, but if they save your life, they're worth it. You can cure an ailment only by going to the root cause, not by patching over its symptoms as we have been doing with our sick environment. Democracy has come to us in two giant historical steps. Constitutional monarchy, which placed restrictions on the absolute powers of rulers through a parliamentary body at first representing members of the church and of the aristocracy, and then representative democracy, which enfranchised all people, men and women, to elect a body of representatives responsible for the affairs of the nation. The time has come to take the next step, participatory democracy, which calls for the establishment of a form of government that reflects the general makeup of the society it governs, involves all citizens as directly as possible in the decision-making process, and remains accountable to the electorate at all times. It is nothing less than the final democratization of democracy, and here are 12 steps that can take us there. Step 1. Canada's current representative democracy does not govern by the will of the majority. For a political party to have a minority of seats in the House of Commons, it needs the support of only a minority of the electorate. Since only the votes of the winning candidate in each riding count, those voting for the others might as well stay home. Most elected MPs represent only a minority of eligible voters in their riding. In 2000, to take a recent example of majority government, the Liberals elected 172 members, which is slightly more than 57% of the seats. In actual fact, the Liberals received less than 41% of the popular vote. And if you factor in that only 64% of the eligible voters cast a ballot, the Liberals represented a mere 26% of the electorate. In the same election, the PCs garnered 12 seats with a little over 12% of the vote, which means that the Liberals, with less than 5 times the number of votes, won 15 times the number of seats. The same calculations apply to the other parties. Clearly, our electoral system produces a parliament which does not represent the will of the people as expressed by the ballots they cast. Step 1 towards establishing true democracy, therefore, is proportional representation. It so happens that Ontarians had the opportunity to take the step in a popular referendum as part of the elections on October 10th, but they didn't because the media voiced the opinion of the beneficiaries of the current system who oppose proportional representation. In 2007, voters in Ontario had a representation from the Ontario Citizens' Assembly in support of the mixed-member proportional electoral system they had recommended. So I shall not rehearse the many advantages of the system, except to point out that it will address one of the most serious problems afflicting democracy today, the growing apathy, if not outright cynicism, of the electorate towards politics, politicians, and the political process itself. Fewer and fewer people, especially among the young, bother to exercise their right to vote because they feel it won't make any difference. It won't curb corruption in government or bring to power people of integrity or of truly public spirit. The proportion of the electorate voting has come perilously close to and sometimes has fallen below 50%. If that process continues, oligarchy or dictatorship will be the inevitable consequence. On the other hand, proportional representation will finally make true what has been an empty slogan so far, namely that every vote counts. Step 2. But it's not good enough for us to go to the polls every 4 or 5 years to elect a bunch of politicians who promise us a better future, only to renege on their promises once they're in power. In order to hold them to their promises, I'm suggesting as step 2 that well in advance of elections, every political party must put in print the policies it proposes to pursue on the major issues, including financial dispositions. If elected to power, the party is obliged to follow its program and cannot deviate from it without putting the proposed changes to a referendum. Step 3. Whereas the horrendous expenses of media use make political parties dependent on the wealthy sector of society to raise the large amounts of money they require to finance their promotions and campaigns, and whereas these benefactors expect them to legislate for their benefit, i.e., the benefit of large corporations and wealthy individuals, and whereas their interests are most often diametrically opposed to those of the people at large, I suggest as step 3 that all financial contributions to political parties should go to an impartially controlled fund that will distribute the money among all the political parties represented in the House in proportion to their actual representation. Step 4. In order to create a level playing field for all eligible political parties to be able to place their policies before the public, the media must provide equal time and space, free of charge, to all parties and their candidates. The amount of additional paid for publicity on behalf of candidates and/or parties should be limited to prevent money and charisma instead of sound public policies from determining the outcome of elections. Step 5. In order to assure that MPs can honestly represent the concerns and views of their constituents, it is essential that they be free to vote at all times according to what they decide is the best interest of their constituency. No political party shall penalize a member for not voting with the party. It makes a mockery of democracy to permit MPs a free vote only on rare occasions when the leader permits them to do so. This is dictatorship, not democracy. Step 6. Government decisions and the processes that lead to them must be made more transparent. No government official shall have the power to declare any government document secret, except for the short period not exceeding a month, for the purpose of showing cause before a judge why the document should not be made accessible to the public or should be redacted. Except where national security is demonstrably jeopardized, such court approval shall be denied. Step 7. Just as Parliament should reflect the popular vote proportionally, so should the Cabinet. We should therefore establish the practice of choosing Cabinet ministers from all elected parties, proportionate to the party standings in the House. Step 8. To put an end to sycophancy and favoritism, Cabinet ministers are to be chosen by lot from among those who have put their names in the hat. Those who fear this would promote ministerial incompetence, I invite you take a close look at any crop of cabinet ministers. One individual recently obtained her ministry by selling her vote, hardly a demonstration of any competence except in opportunism. The common practice of cabinet shuffles that can move an individual overnight from, say, health to justice should be enough to cure us of the notion that competence is a requirement for a government ministry. The appropriate civil servants provide the real know-how in all ministries. Step 9. Inasmuch as it constitutes a serious conflict of interest for MPs to be the final arbiters of their own income, all indemnities, salaries, pensions, and other emoluments of MPs must be determined by an independent body of citizens at arm's length from political interference. As an alternative, I would suggest that MPs be paid the average income earned by the people in the province whose constituency they represent. Whatever option we choose, their income should be brought closer to the income of the people they are supposed to represent. To those who would argue against this because we would fail to attract the best minds for the job, I would say that, first of all, I don't see any evidence that we now have the nation's best minds in government. And secondly, that individuals whose public spirit is inspired by the public purse cannot be trusted with the nation's business. The latest figures I was able to obtain show that MPs earn around $185,000, ministers $272,000, and the Prime Minister $370,000, all for 96 sitting days. Assuming that every MP attends every session, which they don't, that constitutes about 5 months of a regular workload. Of course, the rest of the time, our MPs work hard in their ridings, cutting ribbons, sipping cocktails, shaking hands, and lunching with business and community leaders, all to make sure they retain their sinecure at the next election. Their income for all this is at least 4 times the average income in Canada. In Athens, no one was paid to participate in the democratic process. Only the less affluent received a small stipend to enable them to attend. Instead, we have made of politics a lucrative profession that is more likely to direct those who seek power, privilege, and money than individuals dedicated to public service. Step 10. Politics is too serious a business to be left to politicians. Any ordinary citizen should be able to exercise the right to participate in government. Every citizen is a politician, for it requires nothing more than the application of common sense to public affairs. To ensure greater turnover of MPs, no one should be able to be elected to Parliament more than twice to successive sessions. One of the benefits of this would be to curb the growth of corrupt old boys networks such as operate throughout our political institutions. More importantly, this stricture would put an end to the notion of politics as a profession. The Greeks defined man as the zoon politikon, the political animal. And for Aristotle, an individual became fully human only when he participated in the political process. An idiot in Greek is a person ignorant of politics. Representative democracy has made idiots of too many citizens. To redress the problem, people need to be more directly involved in the political process. This brings me to the last 2 of my suggestions, perhaps most important in ensuring that we complete the third phase in the evolution of democracy, to put governance into the hands of people and establish a true participatory democracy. Step 11. To bring ordinary citizens into the decision-making process, I suggest that a percentage of House of Commons, say 10% of the total, namely between 30 and 40 additional seats, should be chosen from different regions of the country in a manner in which we choose juries from groups of citizens picked at random from telephone directories. The details for this radical change would have to be worked out by a citizens' committee and should be directed towards offsetting the highly undemocratic preponderance of males and of certain professions. Almost 83% of our MPs are men, 40% of them come from business, finance, and managed occupations. Another 38% are drawn from the legal professions. These are the very people interested in perpetuating their privileges. The additional MPs drawn from the general public should be used to add more women to government and more Indigenous individuals, as well as people from the ranks of nurses, farmers, teachers, factory workers, artists, the unemployed, and the young. Step 12. Finally, let us retire the Senate, that gravy train for men and women appointed to lifetime sinecures by the party in power for toadying long and loud enough to them and their politics, and who are expected to continue to do so after their lucrative appointment. This has become a legalized form of shameless patronage. The occasional distinguished Canadian amongst them does not change the entirely undemocratic nature of the institution in place of this expensive extravaganza. In place of this expensive extravaganza, I suggest an assembly of citizens, perhaps half the size of the Senate, composed of individuals appointed by or elected in the provinces on the basis of good citizenship. 2 or 3 members from each province and territory should be sufficient, and they should be rotated every 2 or 3 years. Their function would be to propose, scrutinize, and veto government legislation. It should be obvious that the last 2 steps are interdependent. The creation of a strong assembly of citizens with the appropriate legislative powers would certainly diminish the need for appointing ordinary citizens to Parliament on the basis of a process of random public selection, though I wouldn't want to dismiss the idea out of hand. None of the 12 steps have proposed as the path of democracy are chiseled in stone. They are proposals to be examined, honed, and vetted by men and women from both inside the political process and those outside. Nor am I naive enough to expect to see all these changes in my lifetime. But unless we take serious steps in the direction in which these proposals point, steps on the road to a government of, by, and for the people, our future is doubtful. Time is running out. Some disasters have already become inevitable. If we are to avoid the worst, we must make important decisions now, decisions that run counter to the consumerism that we're being sold as a panacea when it is in fact the source of our undoing. We must learn that bigger is not better, but that smaller is smarter. And we must act accordingly. Our planet can no longer sustain the pampered, selfish dolce vita many now claim as their birthright. Sacrifices will have to be made, and voices of reason, still too far and few between, must grow louder and guide us. We will be judged for our actions by the survivors of the disasters that have descended on us. Let me end by quoting Martin Luther King. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridor of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. Should you wish to obtain a copy of Henry Beissel's Catastrophic Glory, you can inquire at humanistfreedoms@gmail.com, and we'll be happy to pass your inquiry along. Thank you for taking time to visit the Humanist Freedoms podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening as much as we enjoyed putting the show together. If you liked this or any episode of the podcast, please consider subscribing or leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a humanist story idea, or feedback to share, you can reach us at humanistfreedoms@gmail.com.